Your soulmate did not discover the truth because someone finally decided to confess everything out of kindness. They discovered it because one detail from the past stopped making sense, and once they pulled on that thread, the entire story they had been living inside began to come apart. For years, your soulmate believed they had been pushed toward another marriage because circumstances left them with little choice. They told themselves family pressure had simply become too strong, timing between you had become too complicated, and perhaps life was forcing them toward the safer path even if their heart had once wanted something very different. They may have repeated those explanations so often that they eventually sounded like facts. But recently, they learned that what happened was not merely the result of pressure coming from many directions. One person had been shaping that pressure much more deliberately than anyone realized. This person knew exactly where your soulmate was vulnerable, knew which fears would make them hesitate, knew which family members could be influenced, and knew that if they could make your soulmate believe choosing you would create chaos, they could make another marriage look like peace. What your soulmate has now discovered is that some of the strongest reasons they were given for walking away from you were not neutral advice at all. They were part of a carefully managed story, and the person who helped build that story has finally been exposed. The first clue came from something small enough that your soulmate almost ignored it. Perhaps an old conversation was mentioned by someone who had no idea how important the detail would become. Maybe a family member casually said, "That was when we were told you had already decided," even though your soulmate knew they had never made that decision at the time. Perhaps someone referred to a message your soulmate supposedly sent, a conversation they supposedly had, or a statement they supposedly made about you that they could not remember saying. At first, they assumed memory was imperfect. Years had passed. Emotions had been intense. But another detail surfaced, then another, and suddenly your soulmate realized different people had been making decisions based on information that did not come directly from them. Their family believed one thing about you. The person they were encouraged to marry believed something else about your soulmate's intentions. And you, from your side, may have been receiving a completely different version of what was happening. Three separate realities had been created around one relationship, and somewhere in the middle was a person who seemed to know exactly what each side needed to hear in order to remain separated. Your soulmate began asking questions they had avoided for years. Who first said you were unwilling to wait? Who claimed you had already moved on? Who told the family that your connection with your soulmate was unstable enough to be abandoned? Who encouraged the idea that another marriage needed to happen quickly, before your soulmate had time to reconsider? The answers kept circling back toward the same person. Perhaps this was a relative whose opinion carried unusual weight, someone older who presented themselves as protective and wise. Perhaps it was a family friend, a sibling, an aunt, an uncle, or someone who had been trusted precisely because they never appeared openly hostile toward you. They may have spoken gently, saying they only wanted what was best. They may have insisted that they were trying to save your soulmate from heartbreak. But your soulmate now sees a pattern that was invisible at the time. Whenever they leaned toward you, this person introduced fear. Whenever they spoke positively about your future together, a new concern suddenly appeared. Whenever your soulmate began questioning whether another marriage was right, someone reminded them how disappointed the family would be, how much damage refusing could cause, or how dangerous it would be to trust a connection that had already become emotionally complicated. For a long time, your soulmate believed these warnings were simply reactions to what they themselves had shared. That belief allowed them to avoid asking whether anyone was actively shaping their perception. But once they began comparing timelines, the pattern became difficult to deny. Some warnings appeared before your soulmate had even expressed the concerns they supposedly addressed. Certain family members became suspicious of you after private conversations with the same person. Information about you seemed to travel faster than it should have, and details were often transformed slightly as they moved. A hesitation became rejection. A request for time became proof you were unwilling to commit. A disagreement became evidence that you were unstable. Your soulmate's own uncertainty was presented to others as certainty. Perhaps the most painful discovery was realizing that while your soulmate thought everyone was independently reaching the same conclusion, many of those conclusions may have originated from one source. That source had a reason. At first, your soulmate did not want to believe the motive could be personal. They wanted to think this person simply made a terrible mistake. Perhaps they were overprotective. Perhaps they misunderstood you. Perhaps they genuinely believed another marriage offered stability. But then something surfaced that made innocence harder to maintain. There may have been an old message, a voice note, a conversation remembered by someone who was finally willing to speak honestly, or even a statement from the person who entered that other marriage. Your soulmate learned that the person behind the pressure had been discussing the outcome before your soulmate had actually agreed to anything. Plans were being made around them while they were still uncertain. People were being reassured that your soulmate would eventually comply. The marriage was not merely offered as one possible future. It was being treated as the future others intended to make inevitable. That realization shook your soulmate because it forced them to reinterpret one of the most confusing periods of their life. They remembered how quickly everything seemed to accelerate. One day they were still wrestling privately with what they felt for you, and suddenly conversations about another marriage were happening everywhere. Family members were talking about timing. Practical arrangements appeared. Questions became pressure. The possibility began feeling like an expectation, then an obligation, then something almost too complicated to stop without disappointing everyone at once. Your soulmate had always believed they simply failed to be brave enough in that period. That may still be partly true. But now they understand that their fear was being amplified by someone who benefited from speed. The less time your soulmate had to think clearly, the less likely they were to return to the question everyone feared they might ask: what if I still want the person I was being told to leave behind? You were that question. Even during the pressure, your soulmate thought about you. That is something they may never have admitted fully. There were nights when they wondered whether they should contact you before things became irreversible. They imagined hearing your voice and knew it might make the path being created around them much harder to follow. They may have opened your messages or looked at your name without sending anything. At times, they told themselves silence was kinder. They believed reaching out would confuse you, confuse them, or create conflict with a family already convinced another direction was necessary. What they did not know was that the same person encouraging their silence may also have been shaping what you believed. Perhaps you were told your soulmate had already chosen another person willingly. Maybe someone suggested they had never been serious about you. Perhaps information reached you that made the upcoming marriage sound like something your soulmate wanted, even while your soulmate was privately feeling trapped between fear, obligation, and a love they did not know how to defend. This is the part now causing them the deepest regret. Your soulmate is beginning to realize how differently you may have interpreted their silence. From your side, there may have been no visible sign of the pressure they were under. You only saw someone who had once made you feel important suddenly allowing another future to form without explaining what was happening. You may have wondered whether everything between you had been exaggerated in your own mind. You may have replayed conversations and asked how someone could speak about connection one way, then move toward another marriage without giving you the dignity of a clear explanation. Your soulmate now understands that while manipulation may explain part of what happened, it does not erase the impact of what you experienced. Someone else may have helped create the fear, but your soulmate still remained silent when truth could have protected you from years of confusion. They know that now. And the person behind it has been exposed in a way nobody expected. The exposure did not necessarily happen through a dramatic confession. It may have happened because two people finally compared what they had been told. One relative remembered being told that you had refused commitment. Another remembered being told that your soulmate had ended things decisively. Someone else had been told the relationship between you was toxic. Yet when these stories were placed side by side, the details contradicted one another. The same person had been giving different explanations to different audiences, each one carefully designed to produce the response they wanted. To the family, they framed you as unreliable. To your soulmate, they framed the family as unwilling to ever accept you. To the other person involved in the marriage, they may have framed your soulmate as emotionally available when they were not. And perhaps to you, directly or indirectly, they framed your soulmate as someone who had already chosen a different life. Once the contradictions surfaced, your soulmate confronted them. The conversation began calmly because part of your soulmate still wanted an innocent explanation. They asked why certain things had been said. They asked where information had come from. The person tried to dismiss the questions as old history. Why reopen this now, they may have said. Everything happened for a reason. But that answer only made your soulmate more suspicious. They asked again. Why tell one person one thing and someone else another? Why push for the marriage before your soulmate had made a clear decision? Why make the situation sound urgent? The person became defensive. That was when the truth started slipping out. They may have said your soulmate was too emotionally attached to you to make the right decision on their own. They may have admitted they believed you would pull your soulmate away from family expectations. Perhaps they said they were protecting the family from embarrassment, protecting your soulmate from instability, or preventing a relationship they personally believed would create problems. Every explanation sounded like concern until your soulmate asked the one question that exposed the arrogance underneath it. Why didn't you let me choose? There was no good answer. Because that was the real violation. Even if this person genuinely disliked you, even if they believed another marriage would be safer, they had made themselves the judge of a decision that belonged to your soulmate. They did not trust your soulmate's feelings enough to let them experience consequences honestly. Instead, they manipulated the environment until one choice became emotionally expensive and another became almost impossible to refuse. Your soulmate felt anger unlike anything they expected. But beneath the anger was something worse, grief. They began grieving the decision they were never allowed to make with clear information. They wondered what might have happened if the family had heard the truth about you instead of fear. They wondered what might have happened if you had known they were under pressure rather than interpreting their silence as indifference. They wondered what might have happened if they had been given time instead of urgency. These questions are painful because there is no way to return to that exact moment and test another outcome. And yet your soulmate is not placing all responsibility outside themselves. This is important. For a brief period after the exposure, blaming the person behind everything would have been easy. It would have allowed your soulmate to tell themselves, "None of this was my choice." But as the shock settled, another truth emerged. Manipulation worked because it found fear already inside them. The person behind the pressure did not invent your soulmate's fear of disappointing family. They used it. They did not create every doubt about whether the connection could survive. They magnified those doubts. They did not physically force your soulmate into silence. They created conditions where silence felt easier, and your soulmate chose the easier path. That distinction is changing them. Your soulmate now sees that the person who interfered is responsible for their actions, but your soulmate is responsible for the moments when they abandoned their own judgment. This realization may be even more important than the exposure itself. Because if your soulmate only decides someone else ruined everything, they learn nothing. Another powerful voice could influence them again. But if they understand why their own fear made them vulnerable to manipulation, then the experience becomes a turning point. They are asking themselves hard questions. Why did approval matter so much? Why did they assume keeping everyone else comfortable was more important than telling you the truth? Why was disappointing family more frightening than disappointing the person they claimed to love? Why did they believe avoiding conflict would somehow prevent pain when avoidance ultimately created more pain than honesty might have? Your soulmate has begun understanding that they were not only pushed into another marriage. They were pushed into becoming a version of themselves they barely recognized. A version that smiled when they were uncertain. A version that said, "This is probably for the best," while privately wondering about you. A version that accepted congratulations while part of their heart felt as though something important had been buried without being properly mourned. The person who exposed the manipulation may also have revealed something about that marriage your soulmate had never known. Perhaps the other person involved had sensed from the beginning that your soulmate's heart was not fully present. Maybe they were told your soulmate needed time but would eventually forget you. Perhaps they were reassured that once the marriage happened, attachment would follow automatically. If so, another person may have been hurt by the same manipulation. Your soulmate now sees that forcing a marriage did not protect anyone. It simply distributed pain among people who were denied honest choices. This realization is preventing them from turning the story into something simplistic. The other marriage was not necessarily built around an evil person stealing your soulmate. The person they married may have been operating with incomplete information too. They may have believed your soulmate had freely chosen them. They may have entered the situation trusting promises made by the same people who were hiding the full story. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that the true problem was not competition between you and someone else. It was a system of secrecy and fear in which nobody had access to the whole truth. And your soulmate is done living inside it. That is what has changed most since the exposure. For years, they may have accepted a version of life built around duty. They learned how to function. They did what was expected. They may even have found moments of genuine care, respect, or stability within the life that followed. Human beings are complicated. A decision made under pressure can still contain real relationships, responsibilities, and consequences. Your soulmate understands this. They are not treating exposure as permission to destroy lives recklessly. But knowing the truth has made pretending impossible. They can no longer tell themselves what happened was simply fate. They can no longer say, maybe it was meant to be, every time regret becomes uncomfortable. For the first time, they are separating destiny from interference. That difference is enormous. They used to call the marriage inevitable. Now they see how deliberately inevitability was manufactured. They used to believe you and they were separated because the universe closed the door. Now they wonder how much of that door was closed by people. They used to believe they were weak because they could not let you go emotionally. Now they understand why part of them never achieved closure. Closure is difficult when the ending was never based on an honest decision. Your soulmate has returned mentally to the final days before everything changed. Details they had buried are coming back. They remember perhaps one conversation where you asked what was wrong and they could not tell you. They remember wanting to say, everyone is pushing me towards something I don't know if I want, but fear stopped them. Perhaps they thought telling you would force a confrontation they were not ready to survive. Maybe they worried you would ask them to choose immediately. Instead of trusting you with the truth, they tried to carry the pressure alone. You experienced the result, not the cause. And now your soulmate understands how unfair that was. They imagine telling you everything and know there is one response from you they fear more than anger. What difference does it make now? Because from your perspective, the truth may explain the past without changing what the past cost you. Your soulmate knows they cannot expect revelation to erase damage. They cannot arrive and say, I was manipulated, as though that automatically restores trust. They cannot ask you to forget the silence. They cannot pretend you did not spend years creating explanations for something they could have explained themselves. They are beginning to understand that the truth they discovered belongs to you too, but they do not control what you do with it. This is why they have not rushed toward you yet, even though part of them desperately wants to. They are preparing for a conversation that has to be different from every conversation they avoided before. No half-truths. No protecting family members. No minimizing what happened because the details are embarrassing. No asking you to immediately comfort them for being manipulated. They want to tell you who interfered, what was said, what they believed, what they now know was false, and most importantly, what part of the responsibility remains theirs. There is something else they may have uncovered, something that has made the exposure even more personal. The person behind the pressure may have known how deeply your soulmate felt for you. They may have seen messages, witnessed conversations, or heard your soulmate speak about you in private. They did not interfere because they thought the connection was insignificant. They interfered because they knew it was significant. That is why speed mattered. That is why your soulmate had to be made afraid. That is why your reputation needed to be weakened. If what existed between you had been fragile already, nobody would have needed to work so hard to redirect it. This realization has changed the way your soulmate sees their own feelings. For years, they may have wondered whether they exaggerated what you meant because the relationship never became what they wanted. Now they understand that even the people trying to separate you recognize the depth of the bond. The interference itself became evidence of what someone was afraid might happen if you and your soulmate were allowed to choose freely. That thought is dangerous because it awakens old hope. Your soulmate is trying not to romanticize it. They know a connection being powerful does not automatically mean it should be restored. Years have passed. People change. You changed. They changed. The truth does not erase current reality. But one question refuses to leave them. If I had known then what I know now, would I have chosen differently? The answer is becoming painfully clear. Yes. At minimum, they would have fought for the right to choose. That is what they regret most. Not only losing you, losing their own voice. The person who interfered stole some clarity from them, but fear made them surrender the rest. That is the deeper exposure happening now. Your soulmate is seeing the manipulator. But they are also seeing the frightened version of themselves who cooperated with manipulation because independent choice felt too dangerous. They do not want to be that person anymore. This may be why people around them have started noticing a difference. They ask more questions now. They no longer accept "this is what the family decided" as a complete explanation. They have become less willing to let others speak for them. If someone tells them what they should feel, they pause instead of immediately adjusting themselves to fit the expectation. The person behind the old plan does not like this change. They may have tried to defend themselves after the exposure. Perhaps they said, "Everything worked out, didn't it?" Your soulmate may have felt something cold move through them when they heard that. Because working out is not the same as being freely chosen. A life can function while containing unresolved grief. A person can fulfill responsibilities while still wondering which parts of themselves were abandoned to get there. Your soulmate now understands that nobody else has the right to decide whether the outcome justified the manipulation. The exposed person may have apologized. Or perhaps they refused. Either way, your soulmate's relationship with them has changed. Trust has been damaged. Not simply because they disliked you. Because they believed they had the right to control your soulmate's future. There is one family member who may have reacted very differently when the truth surfaced. Perhaps someone who once supported the other marriage became quiet and eventually admitted they had been misled too. They may have apologized to your soulmate for adding pressure. They may even have said something about you. "I thought they didn't want you." That sentence may have broken your soulmate in a way anger never could. Because it confirmed one of the worst possibilities. People who might have accepted your connection were made to believe acceptance was unnecessary because you had already rejected it. Your soulmate asked where that belief came from. The same name surfaced again. The exposure became complete. There was no longer a reasonable way to call everything coincidence. Your soulmate left that conversation carrying a strange combination of rage and clarity. And for the first time in years, they looked at your old messages not as something forbidden, but as evidence. They reread the things you actually said. Perhaps you had written something like, "I can't keep fighting a battle if you won't stand beside me." Someone had translated that into, "They don't want this anymore." Perhaps you said, "I need you to decide what you want." It became, "They're pressuring you." Perhaps you said, "I love you, but I cannot keep living inside uncertainty." People remembered only. They compared them with what people claimed you meant. The difference was painful. The uncertainty, not the love. Your soulmate could see now how language had been weaponized. Your boundaries were turned into rejection. Your pain was turned into manipulation. Your desire for clarity was turned into impatience. And their own fear was turned into proof that the relationship was wrong. They closed the old messages and cried. Not because reading them made them believe the past could simply return. They cried because your words had been there all along. The truth had not been absent. They had simply been surrounded by interpretations louder than the truth. Your soulmate is now considering contacting you for one reason before all others. They want to give you back the part of the story that was taken from you. You may have spent years believing they chose someone else freely. You may have assumed you were never enough. You may have blamed yourself for not fighting harder, speaking differently, waiting longer, or becoming easier for their family to accept. Your soulmate wants you to know that the story was more complicated. But they also want to make something clear: you were not responsible for rescuing them from pressure they refused to explain. That is the part of the message they are struggling to write. They do not want the truth to become another burden placed on you. They do not want you reading it and suddenly believing you should have somehow saved them. You could not solve a problem you were never allowed to see clearly. Your soulmate knows that now. The person who interfered has been exposed. But your soulmate's final realization may be even more shocking than the exposure itself. For years, they believed the person behind the pressure was the reason they lost you. Now they understand something more difficult. That person may have pushed. The family may have pressured. Fear may have been cultivated deliberately. But there was one thing nobody could take from your soulmate without permission: their voice. And they gave it away. That is the confession they are most afraid to make to you. Not, "They made me marry someone else." But, I let fear make me silent when I should have told you what was happening. That sentence contains accountability. And accountability is the only thing that can make the truth useful instead of simply tragic. Your soulmate does not know whether hearing it will change anything for you. They know you may have built a life far beyond the moment where you needed an explanation. They know you may hear the name of the person who interfered and feel anger, relief, disbelief, or nothing at all. They know perhaps the strongest response you could give would be peace. But they are finally prepared to risk that. Because they are tired of allowing someone else's choices to decide which truths remain hidden. The person behind the marriage has already been exposed to them. Soon, they may be exposed to you. There is a message your soulmate has begun writing. It does not start with, "I miss you." It does not start with, "I still love you." Those things may be true, but your soulmate understands now that feelings are not the first truth you are owed. The message begins with, "There is something about what happened back then that you were never told." They have written the next sentence several times and erased it. They know once they send it, there is no returning to the simpler story. Family secrets may come into the light. Someone you once trusted may look very different. Your soulmate's own mistakes will have to be named. But for the first time, they are more afraid of continuing the lie than of what honesty might cost. And when they finally tell you why they were pushed toward another marriage, the most important revelation may not be the identity of the person who interfered. It may be discovering that your soulmate has finally become willing to do the one thing they were not willing to do when you needed them most: stand inside the truth, let everyone see it, and choose their own voice even if the people around them do not approve.